alignment, as things progress. So now we have the transit-oriented development. Sorry, I'm getting feedback. Is that normal? Okay. So now we are going to talk tonight about the transit-oriented development study, and that's really around the station. So you're going to have John talk to you all about how potentially land use impacts will intertwine with the stations. And we have 4 stations in Matthews, and the study will look at all 4 stations, but they'll take a deep dive on 2 of those stations. They're called demonstration areas, and one's going to be in our downtown, and the other is going to be in the ENT district. So that'll be interesting for all of us to understand and have a better understanding of how those impacts could happen. And then the third study, which I'll bring later this summer to you all, is the rail trail. And so Jason Lawrence with CATS is the manager of that project, and that runs primarily along the length of the Silver Line light rail as well, but it does deviate on occasion depending on what's around the light rail. So that's sort of an overview, and I'm going to hand it off to John, and hopefully we'll have an interesting discussion about TOD.
Okay, thank you. Welcome to Matthews, Mr. Howard.
Thank you, Mayor, Commissioners, and thank you, Dana, for the intro. Again, I'm John Howard with CATS. I'm co-managing this project. I'm pretty much the contact for CATS, but Monica Holmes from planning is also a manager from the planning side of it. So a few years ago, CATS and planning applied for a grant to do this TOD study, which we received. So now after the MTC decision in April, now we're moving more to the planning part of this TOD study. So I'll talk more about some history here in a second. Let's see if this will work for me. Oh, there we go. So just a brief agenda. I'll talk a little bit about how we got here, a little bit of history with Andy's work. I'll talk about what is TOD, what goals of the study, and also the components of that, and also how the public can get involved. And as Dana stated, there are kind of 3 components to the Silver Line family, if you will. Andy Mock, who is the senior project manager for the design team, again, is working on the engineering piece of that and environmental piece of that project. And Andy does send his regards. I saw him on the way out of the building today. He has to go to a city council meeting in Charlotte tonight, so he would have been here otherwise. But I'll try to channel him the best way I can if you have any questions that are more design related. The second piece, of course, is our TOD study that I'll talk in more detail about, and also the rail trail study. That's a third component. If you've been on the Blue Line light rail system, you've seen the rail trail. It's kind of parallel to that. It's more of a bike and pedestrian trail, non-vehicular network that we're going to try to implement that for the entire Silver Line route. Maybe a little bit of a delay here. Oh, there we go. Just again, a little bit of background. We kicked off this project, feels like many years ago, back in January of 2020, just before COVID hit. And we had one meeting here in Matthews, actually in person. Then we had another meeting in Uptown Charlotte, and then that's when it kind of went to all virtual. So I had to do a big pivot, trying to figure out how to get public input and keep the public engaged without meeting in person. So we did have a series of engagement meetings via Zoom and YouTube for the Silver Line project. We got lots of public comments, great attendance virtually at those meetings. And that led us to the refined LPA, which was adopted in April 28th of this year. And some of y'all were involved in that discussions as well. So now we're moving forward again with the station area planning piece, which is more of a land use and station access plan. And that's going to take place from now until the end of the year. And then we'll have the final report, which will be rolled out hopefully by December, if not early 2022. Okay, here we go. So again, the Silver Line is essentially about 29 stations, about 29 miles, running from Belmont and Gaston County down Wilkinson Boulevard through Center City, Charlotte, Independence Boulevard, transitioning to parts of Monroe Road, and then into Matthews. And as Dana stated, we have 2 demonstration stations, one at Entertainment District and one in downtown Matthews, to do a little bit more of a focused design study on those 2 stations. And then we also have 2 stations planned in Stallings and Indian Trail. So currently the line terminates at the Central Piedmont campus here in Matthews. And from this point on, we'll still work with Andy's team and do some more station refinement. I'm not sure if we're gonna be adding more stations or subtracting, but it's pretty much the set alignment as you see it today. But during our area planning work, we'll have another chance to kind of dig a little bit deeper into exact station locations. But again, the design team will adjust their locations based on not just the TOD study, but also environmental work and their research. So again, that may change moving forward. There we go. So what is TOD? It definitely is about building light rail to get from one place to another, but it's also about building community. We just don't want to just engineer the project. We want to make sure that we build interesting places along the alignment, support neighborhoods that are already there, and also promote new growth where it can accept that growth. So TOD is about, one, mobility and access. Of course, you've got the line itself, but it's also about how people can get to it if you're not riding the train, or if you're taking a bus, or if you're taking the streetcar, if you're riding a bicycle or walking. How do you make those critical connections to get to a station? And then how do you then weave that into the neighborhood around it? Of course, land use is a very important component. Not all stations are going to be alike. If you look at the current Blue Line and BLE that runs up to UNC Charlotte, you'll see that everyone has a different character, if you will. If it's closer in, they tend to be more urban, more higher density. But as you get further out, they tend to be a little bit more lower scale, more suburban. And you might get some infill here and there, but again, with the towns now involved, we want to make sure that we look at your plans, make sure that we don't do anything to run afoul of those, and also to make sure that they kind of integrate with our TOD work. And that leads into design. Again, what's that pedestrian realm? How does the streetscape blend in with light rail? And looking at building heights and density and those kind of things also are part of the design aspect. And then one thing that we haven't talked about before is the equity lens. How do you get people to and from places, jobs, education, neighborhood resources, just things that support neighborhoods and growth. So equity is going to be another part of this discussion in this plan. There we go. And different areas have different land use patterns. This is a slide that pretty much shows, like, on the bottom, kind of a ideal, traditional kind of grid network that you want around stations. And then on the top is what we sometimes see right now is suburban, more cul-de-sac type single family neighborhoods. But how do you make those two fit together? And that's where the access piece comes in to play a really important role. Is how do you create new connections where they make sense? But also, if you're building a new neighborhood, if you will, how do you set it up with the right kind of block structure, the right number of streets, the right mixture of uses? And again, that's where your land use plans and our goals kind of meet in the middle, if you will. Again, so we don't do anything that's going to run afoul of your adopted plans. This is essentially kind of our guiding light, if you will, for how we look at that half-mile radius around the station. So that dotted line is a half mile from the centroid of the station, and this location is Remount Road in Charlotte. But the dashed lines around it is what we call a walk shed, and that's your half-mile walk shed, and that's really all the connections that get you to the station that are existing. And as you can see in this graphic, what's grayed out, that's in between, that's inside that hidden line circle, are places where we don't have any connections at all. So as part of the planning work, we will look to see where we can have those other connections to get people to and from where we have gaps. And where we already have connections, how can we make those better, safer? If it's sidewalks without lighting, or if it's sidewalks without planning strip, bike lanes, how can we make that part of our planning work to make sure we get people, again, to and from these stations a little bit easier? And I kind of touched on this a little bit earlier, just talking about where stations are related to their development growth and maturity. So again, your more suburban stations that are out near 45 or maybe out in the more town locations, you may have land use patterns that aren't quite filled in yet. You might have more industrial areas or areas that maybe won't even accept residential, like the airport. You can't have apartments and houses now in the flight paths. So that might wind up being much like what you see on the left-hand side, more industrial parks, more hotels, that kind of thing. But on the right-hand side is what we see in South End, where prior to Blue Line and light rail, it was really more of an industrial kind of area. And over time, as you all know, that transitioned to what you see now, which is very vibrant, mixed-use environment. And again, part of the study that we're looking at is what did we learn from the Blue Line and BLE can we implement into the Silver Line today? So, and again, ideally, you really want to have that mixture of uses, but again, not all will mature at the same point in time. And again, looking at Matthews, I want to work with you closely to figure out like, you know, how much density makes sense, what kind of land uses make sense. But again, ideally, you want to have a mix of uses, but that may not happen all at once on day one. That could take 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. You know, it just depends on the market sometimes. And this is a slide that we used during our community meeting last week, where we kind of compared what you might think is higher density versus what is actually higher density. So on the left is a typical city downtown, lots of tall buildings and parking lots, but actually on the right is in Charlotte, that's First Ward, which is one of the 4 wards in downtown Charlotte, which is mostly residential, which actually has more density than the slide on the left. So even though it has lower scale buildings, you have more occupying spaces than you do parking lots. So again, that density doesn't have to connect to tall buildings, but it could just be you know, more people in the more compacted area. And these are some images of what we see on the ground now in terms of residential-based mixed use, where you might have on the first level, traditional old development, like you had commercial storefronts on the bottom, then you had office uses or residences on top. And that's what we see right now a lot on the blue line is lots of multifamily, 4-story type apartment buildings that are mostly mixed use in nature. But we also have some mixed use retail that do not have a residential component. So those might have ground floor retail office, but they also have upper stories of some kind of commercial use as well. I think the 2 slides maybe that you can relate to the most are on the right-hand side, the upper right and maybe the bottom right, which is in Davidson, looking at that more of a town village scale of a 2-story building on a corner, maybe 3, depends on, again, what works for Matthews. Another very important aspect of this work is looking at what's the public realm, that is from the street edge to the building frontage, and what are those components? We talk a lot about complete streets and interesting pedestrian areas. So a well-furnished sidewalk with bicycle racks and plantings and receptacles and other things, street furnishings really make that pedestrian realm much more active and interesting. Also, on-street parking helps to buffer traffic usually, and also a wide sidewalk is very beneficial, of course. Then you've got your building frontages with clear glass windows, storefronts, and you all really kind of do this very nicely in your downtown already. I think I skipped one. No, I didn't. So another part of our work is looking at what are the possibilities, where you have sites like the Bojangles Arena and the Evans Auditorium, where you have these 2 sites where a lot of people go to for events, of course, but also what could that parking lot become? Because right now it's just used for parking, but we're really looking at rethinking this. We do have a station planned for the parking lot of the Bowplex, but this thinking like, what's the next life? If a station goes in, can it accept maybe a hotel or higher density development around that station? So we're really thinking ahead about, not just getting off the train and just walking through a parking lot to get to your event, but how does that mature over time, and how can the city and others partner in to make this a really exciting area, and not just a one-stop shop, if you will. And again, even when it comes to parking decks and open spaces, just looking at, again, elevating our design work in terms of, what did we, maybe not do so well on the BLE when it comes to our parking decks, and also what could we do better? We have some open spaces around our stations now, and we do have also Park and Rec is on our team this time. Last time around, we didn't have, I guess, much more intentional work with park and recreation and public spaces, but we'll make sure that we have that in this project. So around our station areas, we talk about affordable housing, but also open space is a very important component as well. Okay, here we go. And it's just being much more intentional about having public open space, not just private, but definitely have public open space and not have to pave over everything. And again, back to the discussion about equity. We talk a lot about housing, of course, but but it's also about small businesses and make sure we can help them stay in place and not displace small business. So we're going to be looking at some best practices for that. We had a couple of webinars in May where we brought in experts from all over the country to talk about displacement and talk about small business retention. So I think in the plan, we're going to have some ideas about how to do that. But again, that's going to be have a much more different lens for this project because, again, we're dealing with Belmont and Gaston County, Matthews, Indian Trails, Dowling. So we're going to make sure that we address those issues as that relates to those towns as well, not just Charlotte focused. And again, tied to the equity question, again, is connecting people to where they need to get to, institutions, colleges, schools, entertainment, employment. So make sure that we look at these maps, and then if Silverline doesn't connect them directly, how can we again use our bus priority network to connect them to these uses to make sure that we can get people to and from where they need to get to. And just to kind of put a little bow on this one, again, we want to make sure that we enhance connectivity, having safe places for people to get to and from the station, encourage development that supports transit, enhance community identity, and also expand opportunities to employment, jobs, and institutions. Any questions so far before I jump into the more of the TOD focused stuff? All right. Again, lessons learned from Blue Line and BLE. When they applied for the grant a few years ago, they took a really good look at what could we have done better in this planning effort. And one is to be a little bit more inclusive in terms of who's on our management team. We already have Dana and her staff, and we have, again, Union County and Gaston County on our team, but also leveraging economic development, housing services to talk about affordable housing, the airport, of course, and CDOT's always at the table, and also the county and park and recreation. So it's kind of expanding how we look at planning for the Silver Line from a staff level. And some of the goals for the study is, one is what kind of places do we want these to be? Again, every station will not be the same. They will not all be South End or North Davidson, the Arts District, but each one will have its own characteristic. So how do we kind of make sure that we have diversity, but also not have a cookie cutter approach? And also looking at preservation. What kind of places should we be preserving along the corridor, not just saying everything has to be new and higher density. We want to make sure we add that character by having places that make sense, whether they're landmarks or just important places that people like. How do we make sure we keep those in place and not displace those uses? And also, how ready is the corridor for TOD? What's our market telling us today and what it might look like in the future? And again, those connections, sidewalks, bike facilities, the rail trail is a major component of this, and also the greenway and other roadway connections. And I already kind of talked about this one as far as how this plan is a lot different. We want to really educate the public on TOD as well, which we didn't do a whole lot of that early on. If you were involved or remember, we really did this planning work for Blue Line and BLE kind of in a reactionary way, not this far in advance. So we're years out, of course, from construction, but we want to make sure that we get this information out earlier than later or after the fact. And again, that works hand in hand with the design team's work. Okay, I already did this one. Yes, there we go. Thank you. So some work completed so far. We have completed the existing conditions report, and that has market readiness information in it. It's got the walk sheds I talked about earlier. It's got some other very high level information about the stations, and just talking about the planning efforts that you all have done. All that is part of our existing conditions report. So that is still somewhat of a draft because we're still working with the design team on some station alternatives, but again, that's just kind of a baseline of information for us to kind of work from. to one plan and for each station area. And we're going to do a deep dive into 7 of those station areas. We have 4 in the Matthews area, but as far as doing like a detailed analysis, that will be done in 2 stations, downtown and entertainment district in Matthews, and also 4 in Charlotte, and then 1 in the city of Belmont. So those will be a little bit more intensive, more graphics, of course, more details about housing and maybe some potential numbers, looking at maybe publicly owned land, and just do a much more rigid analysis of what that station could look like. And again, the other component of our plan is to do an infrastructure plan, and not a cost analysis per se, but more of a high level, these are your major connections that we've got to make the station really work. And then maybe here's some secondary locations, but can we identify, those critical connection points if they're not
up by the university area, and I was impressed with the artwork at every station, either color, like you saw on one of these slides, or just a piece of artwork, and they were different at each station. I assume that that will be a pattern throughout, that all the stations will have something.
That's
I think
correct.
it adds a lot.
Yeah, so we have a 1% for art that's tied into the project. So we would have artists brought on board to help figure out what the right kind of artwork is for the different station areas. So yeah, that will be a component of the project.
Very good.
That's correct.
Consider a train as part of the art in Matthews, since we're a train city.
Duly noted.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Any other questions or comments for Mr. Howard? We really appreciate your presentation. Thank you.
Anytime. Thank you.
Dana, is there anything else we need to discuss?
Unless you have questions about anything for, for Silverline, I mean, we don't have anything beyond the TOD tonight.
Dana, as you know, I serve on Carpo and MTC, but have you, and so I hear probably everything that you do, but are you aware of any other potential funding sources for the Silver Line? I get asked about, once a week when they're going to build it. And I'm like, well, I don't think we have the money to pay for it yet. So.
Correct.
That's the answer. I was going to say, at the meeting tonight, City Manager Jones for Charlotte's going to talk about the transit funding. So if you want to tune in later on and hear what he's going to talk about as far as, and we don't know what he's going to say, actually. So that's going to be on the agenda tonight, though. Let's talk about the mobility plan.
Great. Thank you.
Nothing else from me.
Okay. Again, thank you very much. Appreciate the presentation. All right, this meeting is concluded. We'll come back together at 7 for our regular meeting. Thank you. All right.